Ever get that feeling, when you're stuck in traffic or on a long commute, and you just wish you could use that time to learn something new? Well, what if I told you you could actually nourish your mind, even on the go?
Sounds pretty intriguing. What did you have in mind?
Right. Let's unpack this, shall we? We're going deep on the Spanish Civil War today.
The Spanish Civil War, yeah.
And I think, everyone's heard of it, but
Reds versus whites.
yeah, it's way more complicated than that.
It's so much more complex.
Yeah.
And the sources that you gave me, I mean,
Oh, yeah.
it's amazing, like, just how...
I went a little overboard, I think.
No, it was fantastic.
Okay, good.
It was really good.
So we've got everything from, like, the classic Beevor book,
Yeah.
The Battle for Spain, but also, like, some really deep political analysis and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So where do we even begin with this?
I think one of the things that people don't realize, they think it was just this sudden eruption.
Right.
But it goes, like, way back.
Yeah.
So, like, if you think about the Reconquista, right?
Yeah.
The reconquest of Spain, the Christian reconquest of Spain from the Moors, it casts a really long shadow on everything that happens after. And it's not just the dates and the battles, but it's like the whole idea of what it meant to be Spanish.
Right.
It gets so wrapped up in Catholicism and in that power dynamic that it resonates, especially with the nationalist side.
So that whole, like, Holy Crusade thing was more than just propaganda. It was tapping into something much deeper.
It was tapping into this
centuries old
idea of what it meant to be Spanish, the sort of like Catholic identity, which the Republic was seen to be challenging, right?
Right.
And then on top of that, you have the First Republic in the 1870s, which is really short-lived, but it's a sign of the unrest that's already, like, brewing. And their attempts at radical reforms, like getting rid of mandatory military service, it backfires spectacularly.
Right.
But then all those desires for reform and change, those don't disappear.
No.
They just go underground and they fester.
Okay.
And then into that mix, you get the rise of anarchism in Spain.
Okay.
Like Bakunin's ideas, they really found fertile ground there.
So this is where we start to get beyond just like the monarchists and the traditionalists. You get something totally new.
You get something totally new, and especially, like, it was the working class in Spain that was really taken with these anarchist ideas.
So when we say anarchism, are we talking about, like, chaos and, like, no rules?
Not at all. Not at all. This
right.
is about a vision of a society without a state.
Oh, okay.
Based on self-management, on cooperation.
All right, so, like, a totally different way of organizing.
The total reorganization of society from the ground up.
Okay, got it.
And this all kind of comes to a head, you could say, with the Semana Tragica.
The Semana Tragica, yeah.
In 1909 in Barcelona.
Yeah, that was like a powder keg.
It was a powder keg, and it started as, like, anti-military protests, but it becomes this, like, microcosm of everything that's going wrong in Spain.
Yeah.
You've got the government that needs troops for the war in Morocco. But the working class families, they can't afford to buy their sons out of service.
Right.
And so what starts as a protest against this far-off war turns into this massive, like, riot.
And a really brutal crackdown.
Oh, incredibly brutal.
It feels like a preview.
It does.
Of the Civil War.
Yeah, it foreshadows so much of the violence to come.
Yeah.
And it just shows you how these tensions, they're just bubbling under the surface, and any little spark can set them off.
Okay, so then fast forward a bit. We get to the Second Republic in the 1930s.
Yeah.
Which, let's be honest, inherited a whole mess of problems.
Oh, they were walking into a minefield?
Yeah.
And they tried to fix things, to be fair to them.
Right.
But it was like trying to put out a forest fire with, like, a garden hose.
So their reforms actually made things worse.
They did. They intensified those divisions.
Wow, okay.
And it pushed Spain closer and closer to the brink.
So one thing I think we need to clear up right away is this whole reds versus whites thing.
Yeah, that's a gross oversimplification.
From what I'm seeing in these sources, both sides were way more fragmented than that.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It wasn't just two monolithic blocks facing off against each other.
Right.
It was all these different factions.
Okay.
With their own agendas.
So they weren't exactly, like, singing from the same hymn sheet.
Not at all.
They just happened to be on the same side for now.
They had a common enemy. That's what united them more than anything else.
Okay, so walk me through this a little bit.
Okay, so on the Republican side, you had, like, socialists.
Yeah.
Anarchists, communists.
Communists. Okay.
You had Catalan nationalists who wanted autonomy.
Right, right.
And even liberals, people who just believed in democratic
It's
reform,
a pretty diverse bunch.
incredibly diverse.
Yeah.
And even within those groups, you had further divisions.
Oh, wow.
Like, take the anarchists.
Yeah.
They had these, like, big umbrella organizations, the CNT and the FAI.
Yeah.
And their goal was, a society without a state.
Right, we talked about that.
Yeah, based on self-management.
But the communists, weren't they also on the Republican side?
They were, but they had a very different vision.
Okay.
They, especially the PSUC and the POUM, they wanted a socialist state.
Oh, so with centralized control.
Centralized control, exactly.
So almost like they're fighting two wars at once.
Yes.
Against the nationalists and then amongst themselves.
That's exactly what makes it so complicated and so fascinating.
Yeah, okay.
And on the nationalist side, don't think for a second that they were all on the same page.
Oh, so they had their own internal struggles.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so who are we talking about on that side?
So, obviously, you've got your military officers.
Like Franco.
Franco, yeah.
Okay.
But then you've also got conservative Catholics.
Okay.
Who were really worried about what the Republic was doing.
Like in terms of the church?
Yeah, like separating church and state.
Right, secularizing education?
Exactly, and that was a huge threat to them.
Okay.
And then you've got your monarchists who wanted to bring back the king, restore the traditional monarchy.
Got it.
And then you've got the Falange, this fascist-inspired party that's kind of like...
So they were like the real hardliners.
Yeah, they were the ones who wanted to like remake Spain entirely.
And they were okay with the monarchy.
That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Because the Falange, they were kind of all over the place ideologically.
Really?
Yeah, they had this fascist element for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But they also had some like socialist leanings.
Oh, interesting.
So within the Falange, you had this tension between Spanish nationalism and this kind of national syndicalist, almost socialist approach.
Okay, so just to be clear, we're not talking about like the Soviet Union kind of socialism.
No. This was a very Spanish flavor of socialism.
All right, so even on the nationalist side, you've got these competing visions.
Oh, absolutely.
Wow.
And I think that's what makes the Spanish Civil War so compelling and so tragic.
Right, because it wasn't just good versus evil.
Not at all.
It was this mess.
It was a kaleidoscope of competing interests and ambitions.
Okay, so we've got all these factions.
Mm-hmm.
They're not really united except that they have a common enemy.
Exactly.
And they're all fighting over, like, what Spain should even look like.
Yeah, the future of Spain is up for grabs.
All right, so we've set the stage, but there's obviously, like, a lot more to unpack here.
Oh, yeah, we're just getting started.
Yeah, this is just the beginning.
We haven't even talked about the foreign intervention yet.
Right. Germany, Italy, the Soviet Union.
It's a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, so we'll get into all of that.
We will.
After the break.
And then you bring in the foreign powers.
Oh, yeah. Can't forget about them.
They just, like, throw gasoline on the fire.
Yeah. It's crazy how Spain basically becomes this proxy war.
It was a testing ground for all the ideologies that were clashing in Europe at the time.
So, like, a dress rehearsal for World War II.
In a lot of ways, yeah.
It's just the scale of the foreign intervention, it's mind-boggling.
It's really something, like...
Germany and Italy, they're all in on Franco.
Oh, yeah, they're sending tanks, planes.
And the Soviets are trying to prop up the Republic.
Mm-hmm. But not as openly.
Right. They're playing it a bit more.
Covertly.
Yeah.
But make no mistake, they were deeply involved.
It's just so cynical, you know?
What do you mean?
All these countries talking about non-intervention.
Oh, yeah, the non-intervention committee.
What a joke.
Right, like the biggest farce of the 20th century.
Meanwhile, they're all pouring weapons and money into the conflict.
It just goes to show you, like, how much words can mean.
Yeah, or how little they can mean.
Exactly.
It feels eerily similar to some of the stuff we see happening today, you know?
Oh, absolutely.
Powers saying one thing but doing another.
It's like the playbook hasn't changed that much.
No, it hasn't.
But back to Spain, it wasn't just the military conflict that was intense. The propaganda war was raging as well.
Oh, the propaganda was off the charts.
And the nationalists, they were particularly good at it.
Yeah, they really knew how to frame the conflict.
They painted this picture of, like, good versus evil.
Right, like they were the saviors of Spain.
Yeah, the defenders of traditional values.
Catholicism, the monarchy, all that.
It was all tied together.
It was effective, wasn't it?
Incredibly effective, both domestically and internationally.
Yeah, I mean, they got a lot of people to buy into that narrative.
They really did.
But didn't the Republicans try to fight back on the propaganda front?
They did. They tried.
Like with Guernica.
Guernica was a huge turning point.
Yeah, when the German Condor Legion bombed that Basque town.
It was a horrific attack on civilians.
And the Republicans, they used it to show the world the brutality of the nationalists.
They tried to expose the atrocities, the foreign involvement.
Right, to paint them as the aggressors.
And to rally support for the Republican cause.
But did it work?
It did to some extent, but the nationalists controlled most of the media.
Right, so their message was getting out more widely.
Yeah, and their message was simpler, more appealing to people who were tired of chaos and uncertainty.
So they won the propaganda war, even if they didn't win every battle.
You could say that, yes.
It's a reminder that controlling the narrative is crucial.
In any conflict, yeah.
All right, so we've got this mess of factions. Foreign powers meddling, propaganda flying everywhere.
It's a chaotic situation.
What was it actually like for ordinary people in Spain during the Civil War?
It was brutal. It was horrific.
Yeah, these sources don't shy away from the atrocities.
Not at all.
On both sides.
On both sides.
We're talking about mass executions, secret prisons, torture.
Targeted killings, disappearances.
Yeah, it was a reign of terror.
It really was.
Beevor's account of the Badajoz massacre, that was particularly chilling.
Oh, yeah. That was a horrific incident.
Thousands of civilians killed by nationalist forces.
And that was just one example.
Yeah, I mean, this kind of stuff was happening all over Spain.
Families were torn apart. Communities were destroyed.
The trauma, the psychological scars.
Those lasted for generations.
Easy to get lost in the big picture.
Yeah, the political and military strategies.
But it's important to remember the human cost.
The individual lives that were shattered.
There are some incredible stories of resilience, though.
Oh, absolutely.
People helping each other, finding ways to survive.
It's a testament to the human spirit.
But we also have to talk about the anarchist experiment.
Oh, yes. That was a unique aspect of the Republican side.
It wasn't just about fighting Franco. It was about building a new society.
A radical new society.
Yeah, based on anarchist principles.
They collectivized land, created worker-managed factories.
So they were putting their ideals into practice.
In a very real way.
It sounds almost utopian.
It was incredibly ambitious.
But it ultimately failed, right?
It did, and there were several reasons for that.
Like, was it just the war?
The war was definitely a major factor.
Okay.
It put a huge strain on these fledgling collectives.
Right. They lacked resources.
And experienced leadership.
And they were under constant threat from the nationalists.
Yeah, it was hard to build a new society while you're fighting for your survival.
But they also faced opposition from within the Republican side, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely.
So they had enemies on all sides.
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh, that's tough.
There were clashes with small landowners who saw collectivization as a threat.
Okay, so they weren't all on board with the anarchist vision.
And some of the communist factions, they saw the anarchists as rivals.
So it was like a revolution within a revolution.
Yeah, and those internal divisions, they weakened the republic as a whole.
Okay, so this anarchist experiment.
It was a fascinating experiment.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it was doomed by the war and by those internal conflicts.
It's kind of a tragedy, isn't it?
It is, in a way.
Because it represented this radical alternative to the status quo.
It did, and it shows you just how messy revolutions can be.
Yeah, even with the best intentions.
Sometimes it's just not enough.
And we can't forget about the Soviet Union's role in all of this.
Oh yeah, they were pulling a lot of strings.
Their support for the Republic was crucial.
No doubt about that.
But it came with strings attached.
Yeah, big time.
They were providing weapons, tanks, aircraft.
Even advisors.
But they were also exerting a lot of influence.
They wanted to shape the Republican war effort to suit their own interests.
And then there's the whole dark side of their involvement.
Right, the NKVD.
Their secret police.
Operating in Spain, carrying out purges, eliminating rivals.
Yeah, it's a chilling reminder that the Soviets weren't just benevolent helpers.
They were playing a very dangerous game.
Okay, so we've got this complex web of alliances, betrayals, and hidden agendas.
It's enough to make your head spin.
It really is.
And it's important to remember that the Spanish Civil War wasn't just about Spain.
Right. It was part of this bigger global struggle.
The rise of fascism, the spread of communism.
It was a microcosm of the ideological battles that were about to engulf the world.
Exactly. And within that larger conflict, you had these individuals making life or death decisions.
Based on their loyalties, their beliefs.
It's those human stories that make this period so compelling.
Yeah, it's not just about abstract ideologies.
It's about the people who lived and died for them.
All right, so we've talked about the factions, the foreign intervention, the propaganda,
Mm-hmm.
but we haven't really gotten into the actual fighting yet.
Oh, yeah, the battles themselves.
Those were pretty decisive, weren't they?
Oh, absolutely. They shaped the course of the war.
And introduced some new military technologies and tactics.
That would have a huge impact on warfare in the 20th century.
So where do we begin with this?
Well, one of the early turning points was the airlift of nationalist troops from Morocco.
Oh, right. That was a game changer.
It allowed Franco to quickly move his forces to mainland Spain.
And consolidate his power.
Exactly, and it showcased the growing importance of air power.
Yeah, something we see even more of in World War II.
Absolutely.
Then there's the Battle of Madrid.
Ah, yes, the Siege of Madrid.
Which started in late 1936.
A pivotal moment in the war.
The Republicans, they put up a fierce defense.
They did. They held out for much longer than anyone expected.
And the International Brigades played a key role in that, didn't they?
They did. Their presence boosted Republican morale.
It became this symbol of international resistance against fascism.
Exactly. People from all over the world came to fight for the Republic.
And that slogan, no pasarán.
They shall not pass.
It really captured the spirit of defiance.
It did. It became a rallying cry for the Republic.
But ultimately, Madrid fell, didn't it?
Eventually.
The nationalists, with their superior firepower.
And the support of Germany and Italy.
They were just too strong.
The Republicans fought bravely, but they were outmatched.
So from that point on, it felt like the nationalists were gaining the upper hand.
They were on the offensive.
And then, of course, there's Guernica.
A turning point in the propaganda war.
It showed the world the brutality of the nationalist side.
And the horrors of modern warfare.
The images of that bombed-out town, they were just devastating.
They shocked the world.
So even though the Republicans were putting up a fight,
they were facing an uphill battle
against a better-equipped and more ruthless enemy.
The nationalists were relentless.
Okay, so let's walk through some of the key battles that followed.
All right, so after Madrid,
the nationalists, they started to focus on other parts of Spain.
They targeted the Basque region.
Which was a major blow to the Republic.
It was. They lost valuable industrial resources and manpower.
And then there was the Battle of Teruel.
One of the most brutal battles of the entire war.
Fought in the middle of winter.
Freezing temperatures, heavy snow.
It sounds horrific.
It was. Both sides suffered heavy casualties.
But the nationalists eventually won, right?
They did. They recaptured Teruel.
And that kind of sealed the fate of the Republic, didn't it?
It was a major turning point.
From there, it felt like the nationalists were unstoppable.
They were on a roll.
They launched the Aragon Offensive.
Which shattered the Republican defenses.
And split their territory in two.
It was a devastating blow.
The Republicans, they tried to counterattack.
With the Battle of the Ebro.
Their last major offensive of the war.
A desperate gamble.
But it failed, didn't it?
It did. They couldn't match the nationalist firepower.
So by that point, it was just a matter of time.
The writing was on the wall.
And the final nationalist offensive targeted Catalonia.
Yes, they wanted to capture Barcelona.
The Republican capital.
And they did, in early 1939.
That was the end, wasn't it?
It was. The Republic collapsed.
Franco's forces were in control of all of Spain.
And a new chapter in Spanish history began.
A dark chapter, from what I've read.
It was a period of authoritarian rule, political repression.
The scars of the Civil War ran deep.
They did, and they continue to shape Spain to this day.
So we've covered a lot of ground here.
A lot of ground, yeah.
From the ideology to the battles and the human cost and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But, like, the big question that I always kind of have after something like this is, what if it had gone the other way?
The counterfactual, yeah.
Yeah, like, what if the Republicans had won?
What if, yeah.
I mean, obviously, we can't know for sure.
No.
But based on what we've read, like, it's interesting to speculate, you know?
Absolutely, yeah.
So let's imagine just for a second that the Republic defeats Franco.
Okay.
They establish this lasting democratic government in Spain.
Right.
What do you think, like, how would Spain have evolved differently?
It would be a fundamentally different Spain, obviously.
Okay.
Instead of Franco's dictatorship, which lasted for decades, you might have seen a Spain that was more aligned with, like, the social democracies of Western Europe.
Okay, so, like, more like France or...
Yeah, France, Britain, the Scandinavian countries.
Okay, so, like, socially, politically, economically, like, how do you think a Republican victory would have reshaped Spain?
Socially, I think you would have seen an acceleration of the reforms that the Republic was trying to implement.
Okay.
So, like, education, healthcare, women's rights, those would have been pushed through much more quickly. The Catholic Church's influence would have diminished most likely.
Right. So a more secular society.
A more secular society, yeah.
It's almost like the cultural changes that we saw in like the 60s and 70s
Yeah.
would have happened like decades earlier in Spain.
Potentially, yeah.
Wow. Okay.
And politically, you'd probably see a multi-party democracy.
Okay.
Maybe even a parliamentary system.
Okay.
Similar to what they have in many European countries.
All right. So a very different political landscape.
No, completely different.
But what about economically?
Yeah.
I mean, Spain was already struggling before the war.
Right.
And then you add the devastation of the war on top of that.
Yeah, that's the big unknown.
Yeah.
The Republicans, they had all these plans for like land reform.
Yeah.
Wealth redistribution.
But could they have actually pulled that off?
It's hard to say, especially after a civil war.
Right, because you've got all this damage.
Damage to infrastructure, to the economy.
Yeah.
And you've got these deep divisions within society.
So it's possible that they would have just traded one set of problems for another.
It's very possible, yeah.
Okay, so like not necessarily utopia?
No, not at all.
But definitely a very different Spain.
A very different Spain, yeah.
And how do you think a Republican victory would have affected Spain's relationships with other countries?
That's a really interesting question.
Yeah.
Because instead of being isolated under Franco,
right,
a democratic Spain might have been drawn closer to the Western European powers.
Okay, so like maybe joining NATO?
Potentially, yeah.
The European Economic Community, all that.
It's possible they might have been integrated into the West much earlier.
Wow, so a completely different trajectory.
Completely different, yeah.
It really makes you think like how one event, one outcome can just like change everything.
It can have a ripple effect throughout history.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And that's why it's so important to study these turning points.
Right, to understand the choices that were made.
And the paths that were not taken.
Wow, well, this has been a really eye-opening deep dive.
I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I have. I've learned a lot.
Me too, actually.
It's amazing how much there is to uncover about the Spanish Civil War.
Oh, yeah. It's a bottomless pit of fascinating stories and
yeah.
information and debates. And
it's not just about battles and dates.
Not at all.
It's about the human experience.
The clash of ideologies.
The legacies that we're still grappling with today.
Exactly. It's still relevant.
If anyone's listening and they want to learn more, there's so much out there.
Oh, yeah. Tons of books, documentaries, articles.
And firsthand accounts.
Yeah, those are really powerful.
Yeah.
To hear the voices of the people who lived through it.
So keep exploring, keep learning.
And keep asking those what-if questions.
Yeah, those are the ones that really make you think.
They do. They make us think about the past and the present and the future.
Well, on that note, thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
It really has. And if you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to our channel.
Yeah, and share it with your friends.
Let's keep the conversation going.
Absolutely. There's a link to buy the book in the episode description.